So, hello everyone. As we all know that the Chinese Communist Party (CCP) is very famous and always in news for its human rights violation in various parts of China and the world. The latest, passed national security law, which was passed by Beijing in 2019, has unleashed unprecedented protests in Hong Kong ever since 2019. Therefore, it becomes a very important topic and event to discuss at length. So, we have with us today a very special guest who is going to talk about the human rights situation in Hong Kong. Is none other than Mr. Benedict Rogers. He is the co founder and CEO of Hong Kong Watch. He's an advisor to the World Uyghur Congress, an enthusiastic activist of the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, and the author of an incredible book called The China Nexus. I heartily welcome you to this interview session, sir.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be with you.
Thank you, sir. So, as discussed earlier, we'll start with the questions right away, if that's fine with you, sir.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. So, my first question to you would definitely be that, you have been in Hong Kong, you have studied there, you have worked there. So, can you tell us, can you describe to us how the city was back then and how it is now that the law has been passed and the protests are there? So, that's my first question to you.
Yes, certainly. Well, when I lived in Hong Kong from September 1997 until 2002, the first 5 years after the handover of Hong Kong to China, at that time, Hong Kong, even though it was under Chinese rule, it was still a very free and open city because the principle on which Hong Kong was handed over to China by the UK in 1997 was the principle of one country, two systems, which Deng Xiaoping himself had come up with. And that meant that China had promised that Hong Kong would retain its high degree of autonomy and freedoms for at least 50 years from the time of the handover, so until 2047. And so in those first 5 years, I would say, by and large, one country, two systems worked, and China kept its promises generally, and it was a very free and an open city. And I was working as a journalist in Hong Kong at that time, and I was able to write and publish articles that today would be totally impossible to publish in Hong Kong. And what has changed in Hong Kong in the last few years, I would say, especially since the national security law, but even in the years leading up to the national security law, Hong Kong's freedoms have been pretty much totally dismantled. They started to be sort of slowly eroded, and then under the national security law, they've pretty much disappeared completely. So there is no more freedom of the press. The pro-democracy camp that used to have seats in the legislature now are totally out of the legislature, and many of them are actually in prison. There are hundreds of political prisoners. The entrepreneur and founder of the Apple Daily newspaper, Jimmy Lai, actually today as we speak, marks 1,000 days, more than 2.5 years in jail. And there's no freedom for protest anymore. Anyone who does protest would be immediately arrested and jailed. So Hong Kong has gone from being one of Asia's most open and freest cities to being basically a repressive police state.
Definitely. So we do know that this law is, basically it's to curb the democratic processes in Hong Kong. But how has it affected the activism there in Hong Kong?
Well, it's essentially driven all activism kind of underground and or into exile. It's really extremely difficult to conduct any kind of open activism in Hong Kong today. So that doesn't mean that Hong Kong activists have stopped struggling, but it means that either they have to pursue their struggle from exile, and thousands of Hong Kongers have left the city over the last few years. About 170,000 have come to the UK, and many have gone to Canada and elsewhere. And those who choose to stay in Hong Kong, if they are not imprisoned, have to basically find creative ways to express dissent. It's not possible to openly protest now without being arrested, but people find some creative, subtle ways to continue their struggle.
Yeah, they have to eventually. So, Hong Kong it's a zone in an area of intense economic activity, it's almost like a special economic zone. So, and if there are protests in such an area, it would definitely affect the trade and profits of that area. So, do you think that the CCP can actually afford to have such protests and, affect its trade and economy in Hong Kong, given the latest decline of Chinese economy?
Well, you're right that China's economy is definitely slowing down and is facing a lot of challenges, and the kind of miracle of China's economic boom that we saw in the 90s and until very recently has definitely passed. And what they have done to Hong Kong is, of course, the protests were a cause of instability in the city. But what has been probably even more serious for Hong Kong's economy is the dismantling of Hong Kong's freedoms, because Hong Kong, the reason for Hong Kong's success as an international financial center and trading center was largely because it was an open, free city with the rule of law, with transparency. And I fear that over time, as the rule of law is undermined and basic freedoms and transparency and accountability are undermined, it may well no longer be the international financial center that it used to be.
Talking about economy and infrastructure, unlike the BRI, which was the Belt and Road Initiative, there was another Great Bay Initiative, and it received a less momentum than the BRI, even though it connects 11 cities in the South of China, and it is one of the most notable projects of the CCP. And analysts they are afraid that this initiative will hinder the Hong Kong's freedom in social and economic and legal politically areas, and eventually it will just erode Hong Kong's freedom. And China is actively trying to sinicize Hong Kong, as it's trying to do in Xinjiang and other regions, and it's trying to dilute sovereignty of the Hong Kong. So how do you think that Hong Kong is trying to demarcate between its integration and erosion of identity in China?
Well, you're absolutely right to talk about the threats to Hong Kong identity. I think it's very clear that the Chinese Communist they have introduced a requirement for all government employees, for example, to take an oath of patriotism. But actually what they mean by patriotism is not loyalty or love of the country, but loyalty to the Communist Party. There's increasing pressure on the use of the Cantonese language and the steady rollout of the Mandarin language, which again puts pressure on Hong Kong identity. The CCP has also been rewriting the history books, literally in the curriculum in schools. So all these things are already happening, and I think the proposal to increasingly integrate Hong Kong into the Greater Bay Area will ultimately, if it succeeds, it will simply turn Hong Kong into just another Chinese city. I think that Hong Kongers themselves will certainly do everything they can to resist this. I'm sure that they will continue to speak Cantonese, especially in their homes and families. But I think the diaspora outside Hong Kong also has a big responsibility to maintain Hong Kong identity, even though they're no longer in Hong Kong. And that will be a challenge, because they face the challenge of of integrating into their new homes in the UK or Canada or elsewhere, but at the same time maintaining Hong Kong identity, language, and culture, which is being eroded in Hong Kong itself.
Eventually it's just the part of the whole bigger concept of the national unification of these regions into the mainland China, right, of the CCP. So, and CCP has been on a spree, and it has tried to unify Manchuria, Tibet, East Turkestan, southern Mongolia into the mainland China. And CCP is doing so both in the land front, as in Hong Kong, and the south sea front, as in the South China Sea. So we would like to know your comment about the geopolitical moves, the that spiral, that this pattern, and do you think that it will continue to do so in future?
Yes, I mean, I think under Xi Jinping's leadership in particular, the CCP has shown that it is basically an expansionist force, that it wants to increase its control, both in terms of territory and in terms of influence around the world. And I think clearly the threats, for example, to Taiwan have increased in recent years. And whereas a few years ago, I would have been doubtful about the possibility of China trying to take Taiwan by force, now I would say that it is certainly a possibility. I'm not saying it will definitely happen, but it certainly is a possibility that we should be prepared for. I think Xi Jinping is very, very concerned about his own personal legacy, and he wants to be viewed in history alongside the two other great transformative CCP leaders, Chairman Mao Zedong and then Deng Xiaoping. Chairman Mao's legacy was the establishment of the People's Republic of China. Deng Xiaoping's legacy was the opening up of China economically and the economic boom that China has had in the last few decades. And I think Xi Jinping probably sees his legacy, if he can achieve it, as he would see it, uniting the motherland of China with Taiwan. And I think he is showing all the signs of preparing to do that. I couldn't put a time frame on it, but I think we must be prepared for that possibility.
Yeah, so so far we see that all these victims of CCP authoritarianism and China trying to build its hegemony, we see that people from Tibet or Hong Kong or Taiwan, they're all sort of protesting individually, and today the world is coming together in their support, and they are recognizing that China cannot just hegemonize over the world. It cannot take over these parts. So do you think that there is likely to be an uprising where these victims of CCP authoritarianism from Taiwan, Hong Kong, Uyghurs, the Taiwanese, they can come together and revolt together against the CCP regime?
I think one thing I do see internationally outside China's territory is definitely greater unity among these different groups. So a few years ago, it would be quite rare to see some of these different groups protesting together. But now it's almost every protest outside the Chinese embassy in London, for example, but we see the same in other cities. There are Hong Kongers, Tibetans, Uyghurs coming together. And increasingly, we are also seeing more mainland Chinese students who are studying, for example, in London, actually being much bolder and protesting as well. And I think change in China will not come without the people of the majority population, the Han Chinese. And I think that China's economic slowdown may well be a cause of discontent among the Han Chinese people, as well as the Hong Kongers, Uyghurs, Tibetans, and others. We saw a glimpse of that, of course, at the end of last year with the extraordinary protests across China against the COVID restrictions. And what was interesting about those protests was that in several places, the protesters were not actually saying lift the COVID lockdown. They were shouting Xi Jinping step down, CCP step down. And I've certainly never heard people in China saying that really since the Tiananmen Square protests of 1989. So I think it is possible in the coming years to see greater discontent and to see more protests. The challenge of actually coordinating efforts across Hong Kong, Tibet, Xinjiang, and China itself is more difficult because people may not know each other or have contacts or have secure means of communicating with each other. So there are logistical challenges about sort of unity and cooperation among the different groups within China, but certainly we're seeing it among the diaspora. And I think we may well see future protests in China, which may spark Hong Kongers, Tibetans, Uyghurs also to protest in support.
Yeah, we really hope that happens soon. And so we do know that the protest regarding the Tibetans and the localized people, but what about the global leaders? Like we know that America, it has put sanctions and it's on like actively ongoing. There's a trade war, between China and America, and other people, other leaders, they are trying to decouple from the Chinese economy because there had been a lot of reliance on it. But there is still an absence of rigid actions. There's not a strong ironclad sort of reply to this authoritarianism by the CCP. So do you think that the world is naive in understanding the threat posed by CCP led China, and what lessons can we learn from this Hong Kong protests?
I think the international community and especially the Western world has been quite naive for many years and has really adopted an approach of kowtowing to Beijing because of what they see as the importance of the economic and trading relationship. I think in the last few years, countries are starting to wake up to the challenge of China. And I think, for example, the dismantling of Hong Kong's freedoms in total violation of an international treaty, the Sino-British Joint Declaration, has woken people up. I think that the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, also helped to wake people up to the fact that the Chinese regime, the CCP, does not tell the truth and hides information and cannot be trusted. I think also the evidence that has emerged in recent years about the genocide of the Uyghurs has also helped to wake people up. So I think the naivety is still there among some people, but perhaps less than it was, and countries are slowly starting to wake up. But there needs to be much more both coordination and robust action. As you say, the United States has placed sanctions. The UK, for example, has not put any sanctions on the CCP in response to what's happened in Hong Kong. We have issued a few token sanctions in response to what's happening in Xinjiang, but we've only sanctioned a handful of individuals. So I think we should be doing much more, but much more in coordination with allies like the United States, Canada, Australia, the European Union.
So talking about the international community, where does the United Nations appear in this picture? We know of China allegedly trying to buy the votes from sort of victims who are in need of money. So China gives them loans, cheap loans, like under its debt trap diplomacy, and also China actively tries to hinder the various UN sanctions on terrorists. So whenever there's some sanctions, some resolution trying to come up in the UN, so can the UN be of any help for Hong Kong?
I think you're absolutely right that China has penetrated and influenced the UN, as it has other multilateral organizations in a very alarming way. And in addition to the things that you've just outlined, actually, China seems to have a disproportionate amount of influence on the Secretary General's office itself, because China has been funding a particular fund that is within the Secretary General's office that only the Secretary General and China have control of, and there's no transparency, no accountability. And I detail this in my book, the China Nexus. It was brought to my attention by a former American diplomat who basically said that there is a pot of money in the Secretary General's office that is essentially a Chinese slush fund, and it's, I don't think, any coincidence that the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has said nothing about Hong Kong. He said nothing about the genocide of the Uyghurs. He said nothing about Tibet or about human rights in China. And so I think that is very concerning. There are things that can be done at the UN. For example, in January next year, China faces what's called the Universal Periodic Review, which is a process that every single member state goes through every 4 to 5 years, where their human rights record is reviewed by other member states, and civil society also can input into the process. And so I think it's very important that as many member states as possible raise all the key issues, Hong Kong, but also the Uyghurs, Tibet, human rights in China, in the UPR. There are also UN special rapporteurs who have over the years spoken up on Hong Kong and on the other issues, and continue to do so. So there are things that can be done at the UN to put a spotlight, but we do face this big challenge of China's influence in the UN.
Yeah, so coming back to the protests in Hong Kong, this has been so far, the maximum outreach, that has penetrated in Hong Kong. The number of people who have joined it is humongous, and especially the younger ones. We see a lot of young people engaging in these protests. So why do you think all of a sudden young people are so interested in Hong Kong protests, even though they can, conveniently go and study in other areas, and sort of have their jobs there? And how can the international community, just as you said, UN, they can help, Hong Kong to enjoy their freedom without PRC's influence on them?
Well, with regard to the protests, it's important to note that the main protests took place in 2019 and early 2020, and then they largely stopped, partly because of the COVID period, COVID restrictions, and also then, of course, the national security law, which has made it extremely difficult and dangerous for anyone to protest. So there have not been major protests in Hong Kong since 2019, 2020. But you're absolutely right that at that time, there were many young people who took part in those protests. And I think the main reason they did so was because they were concerned about the future of their home city, and indeed their own futures. They could see that initially those protests were sparked by a proposal by the Hong Kong government to introduce a law that would allow for the extradition of people from Hong Kong into mainland China for prosecution and trial and imprisonment. And up to that point, there had been a clear red line between Hong Kong's legal system and the mainland's legal system, but this extradition law would have basically done away with that and allowed for the extradition of people from Hong Kong into mainland China. And that's what sparked those protests, but they very quickly turned into protests much more about democracy, universal suffrage, human rights. And I think that was because young people could see that the CCP was increasingly intervening and encroaching on Hong Kong's autonomy and freedoms. So that's why they took part. In terms of what can be done going forward, I think the international community should be speaking out much more for those who are in prison in Hong Kong. I mentioned earlier Jimmy Lai, who spent 1,000 days today in prison in Hong Kong, and he's faced several totally fabricated false charges, which has led to his imprisonment. But he still faces his charge under the national security law, and his trial is continuously delayed. And it seems like they want to hold him in prison for as long as possible. And when it eventually comes to trial, it's highly likely he may be sentenced to life. So he may spend the rest of his life in prison. And there are hundreds of other political prisoners also in similar situations. There are 47 former legislators and pro-democracy activists who were arrested and jailed simply for having had a primary election to choose their candidates for what should have been the Legislative Council elections. And the Legislative Council elections were then postponed. And then, in fact, the whole pro-democracy camp was excluded from the legislature. But 47 of them are in prison. Many of them have been denied bail. And their trial is also prolonged. So the international community should be calling for the release of political prisoners. I think we should be imposing sanctions, as I said earlier. And I think bodies like the UN provide a platform where we can spotlight what's happening. In addition to the mechanisms at the UN that I just mentioned earlier, there is also, of course, the treaty body reviews, where China is a party to a number of international human rights covenants and treaties, and they come up for review. Earlier this year, we had the Committee on Women's Rights. Last year, we had the Human Rights Committee. So those are opportunities to spotlight the human rights situation in Hong Kong and in the other areas, and to call for change.
Yeah, so we do see that these political prisoners, they are in jail, they get no bail, and even China has started putting fine on any protesters now. So, do you think that the CCP is successful in demoralizing the protests in Hong Kong? What's your take on that?
For the time being, they have, at least on the surface, had some success. I have to admit that, because there haven't been any protests, any major protests since 2019, 2020, because of the national security law. And also, earlier this summer, the Hong Kong authorities imposed or issued arrest warrants for 8 exiled Hong Kong activists, and actually imposed bounties of $1 million Hong Kong dollars each on these 8 activists. And the 8 activists live outside Hong Kong. 3 of them are in the UK, others are in the US and Australia. And after issuing the arrest warrants and bounties, the authorities in Hong Kong then called in the families of some of these 8 activists, families who are still living in Hong Kong, to interrogate them. And I know from some of the 8 that has had a deep effect on them, and has caused them to, even outside Hong Kong, to reconsider how high profile they should be, how much they should speak out, because they're understandably concerned about the well-being of their families in Hong Kong. So for the time being, yes, the CCP has been quite effective in quelling protests. But I think in the long term, discontent and dissent will emerge again. And I don't think the people of Hong Kong have given up. I think that they will find ways, sometimes, if necessary, subtle, creative ways, to continue to resist the CCP. And eventually, at some point, I think there will be, or there could be, something that sparks further protests. But for the time being, it's so dangerous to protest in Hong Kong now that people have gone understandably quiet.
Yeah, definitely. It sort of looks like, changing narratives and using economic and hard power is the way for the revisionist aim of China and CCP to unify the mainland. What possible measures in this regard do you think that the international community and especially the neighboring countries of China have to counter this hegemonic threat of China in the 21st century?
Well, I think that you're absolutely right to emphasize the role of countries in the region and neighboring countries. And obviously, China's influence in the region, especially in Southeast Asia, has extended very considerably. So I think that Western democracies should work much more closely with countries in the region, especially democracies in the region like India, but also Japan and South Korea, all of which face this challenge. And I think, for example, Japan and South Korea, if there is an attempt by China to invade Taiwan, Japan and South Korea will, of course, be immediately impacted. And I think Japan has already indicated that it would support Taiwan in that situation. And so I think we need to work very closely with countries like Japan in preparation for that. And India, of course, has faced its own tensions and build-up of threats on its border with China. And I think Western countries should work closely with India to defend India's border and stand up to China.
Well, that brings us to the end of this session. We had some serious questions and you answered them so enthusiastically. It was such an enlightening session. On behalf of Red Lantern Analytica, thank you with all my heart for this session. And nobody could have answered, these questions with such gusto and in-depth analysis like you have. It was truly an honor to host you, and we hope that this is just one of the many collaborations that we can have in future. The platform is open for you if you have any more remarks or comments to add.
Well, thank you so much for those very kind words and for hosting me. It's been a pleasure and a privilege to have this conversation. And I look forward definitely to future collaboration. So thank you very much.